All right, let's just dive straight into this. Welcome to our latest explainer. Today, we're unpacking a seriously fascinating psychological profile, the fiercely independent individual. If you're someone who loves getting to the root of human behavior and figuring out what makes people tick, you are in the exact right place. We're going to piece together the hidden psychology of someone who is deeply self-directed, incredibly protective of their peace, and honestly, pretty often misunderstood by society. Let's build a comprehensive case study of the independent mind. So, have you ever noticed how some people just instantly resist the second you tell them what to do? And here's the kicker. This happens even if the advice is objectively good, even if following the instruction would totally help them out. But the very moment they hear a direct command, something deep inside their brain just pushes back. It's a reflex. Now, to an untrained eye, or, a really frustrated manager, this resistance just looks like everyday stubbornness, like a mule digging its heels in the mud. But psychology actually shows us something much more profound. This resistance is driven by a fierce, fundamental need for autonomy. Autonomy is that core feeling that you are the captain of your own ship, with a firm grip on the wheel. For a highly independent mind, a command doesn't register as helpful advice. It registers as an immediate threat to their deeply wired need to steer their own life.
To get the science behind this, we have to look at an amazing psychological concept called psychological reactance. It's essentially the brain's automatic pushback to restore freedom whenever it feels restricted or controlled. It is literally a hardwired defensive reflex. When someone points a finger and says, "You have to do this right now," the independent brain doesn't process the logic of the task first. It processes the restriction of freedom first. And it reflexively thinks, well, now I absolutely don't want to. It isn't about being difficult, it's a completely natural, automatic response to perceived control.
See, the fiercely independent person doesn't just want to say no for the fun of it. They have this deep, driving need to analyze situations for themselves. They want to ask targeted questions, evaluate all the options on the table, and ultimately form their own conclusions. So what looks like sheer defiance to an outsider is actually just the mechanics of a highly active, self-directed mind. A mind that simply refuses to blindly follow instructions without running the data first.
Which leads us directly to a really core truth. Responsibility makes achievements feel more meaningful. Highly independent people possess a profound sense of ownership over their lives. They don't want to succeed just because someone handed them a playbook and ordered them to run the play. They want to succeed because they deliberately chose the path. When they make their own decisions, they take full responsibility for the outcome. And it's exactly that responsibility that gives their achievements real, tangible meaning. So, the crucial takeaway from this first part is a massive shift in perspective. Highly independent people are incredibly sensitive to power dynamics. They can spot when someone is trying to dominate, manipulate, or even subtly control them from an absolute mile away. Because of this high sensitivity, even tiny, seemingly harmless commands can feel like a ton of pressure. What looks like a stubborn refusal to just obey a command is actually a psychological fortress going up. It's the active protection of their boundaries. Okay, so we've established the internal workings of the independent mind. But what happens when this deeply autonomous individual interacts with a deeply insecure society? Well, that brings us to the external conflict, when independence triggers hostility. Have you ever experienced this? Someone acts distant, cold, or downright hostile toward you, and you are just left scratching your head because absolutely no conflict ever took place. You didn't even steal their lunch from the fridge. It is so incredibly confusing. But psychology provides a remarkably clear lens for this. When someone dislikes you for no clear reason, it almost always reveals entirely what is going on inside of them and has very little to do with you. The primary culprit we are looking at here is psychological projection. This is when a person unconsciously assigns their own uncomfortable qualities or insecurities onto someone else. Let's say a person feels secretly inadequate or inauthentic. Instead of dealing with that incredibly painful inner conflict, they just project it outward. They might look at a quiet, independent person and accuse them of being arrogant, fake, or aloof. The independent person is literally just minding their own business, but they become an unwitting mirror for someone else's inner turmoil. Let's unpack the specific anatomy of this unprovoked hostility. People who harbor this baseless dislike usually share some very specific traits. They're constantly comparing themselves to others, measuring their worth against everyone in the room. So when they see someone confident and self-reliant, they experience it as a direct threat to their own self-esteem. They carry a negative bias, assuming negative intentions behind completely neutral actions. If the independent person is quiet, they assume they're being judged. Ultimately, they just need an external target to blame for their own frustrations. It really boils down to a fundamental clash of needs. On one hand, you have individuals who rely heavily on social approval. They need that constant validation from the crowd. On the other hand, you have the self-directed, calm, independent mind. To the approval seeker, quiet self-sufficiency is deeply intimidating. Why? Because the independent person doesn't need the very validation the other person is so desperately chasing. That quiet self-sufficiency creates severe discomfort in the insecure observer, which quickly curdles into irritation and unprovoked dislike.
So what is the eventual result of all this friction? Where does it end up? This brings us to our final act, the breaking point, and the psychology of disappearing. Have you ever known someone to just suddenly cut everyone off? No long arguments, no dramatic explanations, just a sudden, stark distance. To outsiders, it seems totally random or even cold. But what we are really seeing is psychological overload. The human brain has a finite capacity for emotional pressure. When a highly independent person is fed a steady diet of constant conflict, unjust criticism, and relentless emotional demands, their brain's circuitry just overloads.
This exact overload triggers what psychologists call a boundary awakening. And the really key factor here is that this happens after a prolonged period of tolerating disrespect. The cutoff is never actually sudden. It is the delayed climax of months or even years of ignored red flags and trampled boundaries. The independent person usually gives chance after chance, but when the realization finally hits that the environment is truly toxic, the shift is instantaneous. They don't negotiate anymore, they just enforce the limit and remove the source of the stress entirely.
Because independent people are so self-reliant, they're often leaned on as the strong ones, constantly carrying other people's emotional weight. But over time, all that heavy lifting leads straight to emotional burnout. And when burnout peaks, the mind does not crave a resolution. It craves absolute peace and quiet. Stepping away, going silent, and cutting people off actually becomes the only viable medical intervention for a socially exhausted brain.
When an independent mind experiences a deep betrayal, it actually changes their neurobiology. Their brain aggressively ramps up its harm alertness, becoming hypervigilant to manipulation. So cutting ties isn't some act of cruelty, it's a calculated survival tactic to ensure their psychological safety. They are removing people simply to prevent future harm.
Ultimately, what we're witnessing in these moments of disappearing is identity reconstruction. Following trauma, betrayal, or just significant personal growth, an individual realizes that their current environment and the people in it no longer match who they are becoming. It's like a hot air balloon dropping sandbags to gain altitude, they're resetting. During this deeply personal phase, the independent mind will systematically distance themselves from old habits, old environments, and old relationships that no longer serve their hard-won autonomy.
There's this incredibly powerful observation that sums it up. To outsiders, it may look dramatic, but internally, it can feel like relief. When the fiercely independent person asserts their boundaries, resists control, and cuts out the noise of an insecure world, they aren't trying to create drama. They are simply reclaiming their peace. What society views as a cold shutdown is, for them, the very first deep breath of fresh air they've had in years.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to turn inward. As you navigate your own relationships and analyze your own reactions to the people around you, ask yourself honestly, are you protecting your boundaries, like the independent mind, or are you projecting your insecurities onto others? Understanding the difference won't just change how you view other people, it will completely change how you view yourself. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep analyzing the world around you.